So we're going to talk about septic systems. I'm sure you have lots of questions. I will probably have an answer for you. I can't guarantee it, but if I don't know, I can find out. So what we're going to cover, the context and first principles of wastewater treatment on site for septic systems. We'll cover a little bit of the Ontario-wide private septic system, some statistics that were gathered, collated by the Wastewater Association in order to present to the government to try to review whether or not the current building code is adequate for the ongoing operation and maintenance and management of on-site wastewater treatment systems, or whether the building code needs to be improved. Then we'll talk about municipal reinspection programs, the types of municipal reinspection programs for septic systems that exist. It's kind of a high-level overview. We can talk a little bit about what's been working and maybe some improvements that could be made. And then some actionable items, some considerations for cottage owners as to what you can do today, right now, to try to have a positive impact on your septic system. So we'll start with context. So water is a precious local resource. So treating on-site wastewater locally, wastewater treatment is water protection. And I don't just say that because it's true, I also say it because it's really hard to recruit people that want to work their careers in the septic industry. So it's now the water protection industry, are we clear? We are protecting water. Yeah, diving right into the septic presentation. But that's, those are my kids and myself, and this is what we're trying to protect, right? This is what we're doing. This is why. So, a little bit of terminology. On-site sewage disposal versus on-site wastewater treatment. Paradigm shift. Get your head around it. For the longest time, we were trying to dispose of sewage. That's what you're doing on your property. It was working right until it stopped disposing. But it's an insidious problem when it's not performing. It's not protecting the environment. It's ending up in the water table, but it's still disposing of sewage. So now, we have to think of things as on-site wastewater treatment. We need to treat the wastewater to a level that's safe to put back into the environment. That's a big difference. So there's a lot of systems that were designed over 30 years ago that are sewage disposal systems by their very nature. That's how they were designed. It's not the septic system's fault, but it was designed to just get rid of sewage on that property. What is a standard wastewater treatment system? The standard of practice in Ontario presently is for a home connected to a septic tank. That septic tank's function is to separate solids and liquids. The solids will be digested at some rate proportional to the amount of food that they're being given. But it is to separate solids and liquids. There is some digestion of the waste, but primarily it's just the retention of solids. It flows into a series of perforated pipes in a standard system where it percolates into the soil. The reason the pipes are laid out this way and relatively wide and shallow, high in the soil profile, is because it's actually the soil below the pipes and the stone that does the treatment. The soil does the treatment, but the soil can only do the treatment if the soil is unsaturated, meaning the only moisture getting into that soil comes from the pipes. So unsaturated soil is very robust at removing organic materials and pathogens and attenuating, very briefly, some nutrients. But generally, the treatment is for pathogen removal and for organics removal, but it has to be unsaturated. We good on wastewater basics? So what did industry find when we go out there to take a look at systems that are already installed? They already exist. What are we finding? So we had put this, the Wastewater Association had put this data together from two primary sources that were willing to share it. One of those sources was my company, and we put this together into the Environmental Commissioner of Ontario when that position was receiving requests for review of different statutes. We wanted the Environmental Commissioner's Office to review whether or not the building code was adequate for the operation, maintenance, and management of septic systems in Ontario, given the information I'm about to present to you. So the first data set was collected 370 individual clients between 2015 and 2017, and they were inspected as part of due diligence for a real estate transaction. That's why we were on site. But the data is really valid because we were able to collect a lot of information, and they allowed us access to the property and allowed us to dig on the property and really do a comprehensive investigation as part of that due diligence. So there's a lot on here, but the bottom line is still going to be the bottom line here. So of those 370 systems, very small data set, I recognize, so it's not statistically significant, but it is a good picture, a snapshot of what's going on. So that we have 59% of the systems, of those 370 systems inspected, were over 30 years old. Has anybody ever heard how long we project a septic system will last before it fails? 40 years, 40 to 50 years would be reasonable. Which part of it fails is the soil. The soil is a filter, it's a biological filter. So eventually it fails to be able to receive, treat, and then discharge back into the environment the wastewater that's flowing through it. It fails. But if you think about your Brita filter, if you have one at home, does it eventually plug? Does it harder and harder to get water to go through that Brita filter? And that's when you know you need to change it. And that's clean water, relatively speaking, that you're putting through it. So this soil filter is actually being used to treat wastewater to a safe level, so eventually that soil filter will fail. It's designed to fail when you have a standard septic system. It's just when, it's not if. And that's from both a functional perspective as well as a performance perspective. So the bottom line here is that almost 60% of the systems were 30 years old, so they're approaching a vulnerability to failure. They're at the end of their functional lifespan. So there's some major deficiencies in these systems. The major ones, and I'll read them. So we have a field failure, so it's not receiving wastewater at all. It's coming to the ground surface or leaking out somewhere else. The leaching field is not taking water. That's a field failure. A deficient outlet baffle. The outlet baffle is the component of the septic tank that keeps the solids from just floating on out. Because the function of the septic tank is to retain those solids. So if the baffle's missing those solids out in the leaching field, they plug all the pore spaces and the field fails. There's a saturated system. This could be an elevated groundwater level. It might not be saturated from the septic system, but it's saturated from other extraneous flows in the area that keep the soil saturated. It's non-functional. The water may never come to the top, but it short circuits through. So you end up with septic tank effluent immediately mixing with the groundwater table with no soil treatment. We could have sludge in the system, in the pipes in the bed, and that's typically associated with the deficient outlet baffle, but also could be from high levels. So the baffle's in place, but the water levels come up in the tank when they can't get out to the field because the field is saturated. So as the water level recedes, all of the floating scum and material goes over the top of that outlet baffle and is transmitted out into the pipes. And then the last one is heavy tank corrosion and failure. Concrete has a life expectancy in septic tanks. The hydrogen sulfide gas produced in the natural ecosystem that is a septic tank is corrosive to concrete. It needs to be vented out of the tank. But if the scum level in the tank is allowed to accumulate to a level where there's no airspace at the top of the tank, the gases become trapped, typically on the discharge end of the tank, and will eat through the concrete to the point where you can push a metal rod right through the concrete wall, or the wall just disintegrates. You can't see it from grade, but the water is escaping around the outside of the tank and the pipe and not going out to the leaching field, but is actually just draining around the tank. Sometimes it'll end up back in the foundation drainage system. Other times it'll just leak out across the rock. So it never actually gets to the leaching field because the tank is corrupted. But of the major causes of deficiency in a septic system that are problematic, 64% are found in the leaching field. The majority of the problems are in the most important part. And this is how we correlate the age of a system with the deficiencies. Anybody here notice that as you age, your health maybe declines a little? Yeah. So it's the same with septic systems. You are really just a big septic system. So of the systems 30 years and older, 66% had the major deficiencies. So the easiest risk factor for septic system function and performance is age. So it's easy to do a risk assessment of which systems might need to have some sort of intervention or at least an inspection. So that's the small data set with very in-depth inspection techniques. Now this is a much larger data set that we're lucky to have WSP Canada willing to share this information with industry and with all the other public stakeholders because very few people are willing to share their reinspection data. So this is a data set that has almost 7,700 individual properties inspected in just 4 years, which is phenomenal that they got that much work done. They administer the program for a municipality, and the information that we have available is from those inspections. This is a little bit different. I'm not comparing the two types. This is different information, but The municipal reinspection found tank volumes. If we know that a septic tank's job is to separate solids and liquids, the larger the tank, the more likely it will do its job efficiently. So a bigger septic tank is a better septic tank. When you are pumping out a septic tank, you're not trying to remove the liquid fraction. What you're trying to do is remove the solids fraction that's accumulated at the bottom and at the top of the tank that ostensibly is making the tank volume smaller for the working capacity. The smaller volume tank has less time that the sewage spends in it. So when you're pumping out your tank to remove accumulated solids to rejuvenate the tank's capacity. Does this make sense? Okay. The bad news is the number of tanks in this particular data set that were under the current minimum capacity of 800 gallons or 3,600 liters. So if you look, almost 50% of the systems were under capacity by today's standards. And then this is profound. And we found it in our own data, but this is the biggest data set that has shown this. Of those almost 7,700 systems that were inspected, 74% of those systems didn't need to be pumped out. The message there is a pump out is not an inspection program. And in 74% of the cases, it didn't need to happen. So if you're pumping tanks out to do an inspection, I challenge you to inspect my coffee cup full of coffee to see if it'll hold coffee by dumping it out first. The damage to concrete in a septic tank occurs above the water level. So you don't need to pump a tank out to find out if the tank's working. You want to have, if it's going to be inspected, you want it to be full. So if you're putting municipal reinspection programs together, stay away from the pump out requirement. We're talking about our environmental footprint and our carbon footprint. Hauling sewage unnecessarily is risky and dumb. I'll say it again, it's risky and it's dumb. It also takes some time for that tank to work its way back into its appropriate ecological equilibrium so that it can continue to digest solids. So please do not pump your septic tank unless it's been measured first. And if it's been measured, it can't have more than 1/3 the working capacity full of solids. If it's under that, don't pump it. Save the money, but also save the carbon footprint that we put of these big trucks driving up and down the type of roads that probably can't handle that kind of traffic. So just be cautious with the pump out as inspection. We have data to support that it's not necessary. And if it is necessary, in the cases that it was, they got pumped out. I'm sure that over time we'll find that pump outs costs tend to go up just based on the risk. And again, system age profiles. This is from the WSP data. So they had records back to 1970 in this area. It's South Bruce Peninsula, other side of the bay. We're still in cottage country here. 1970, you can see that 77% of the systems didn't have a record that was after 1970. So think of our age profile and the risks. So they had an unknown age, not that they couldn't figure it out, they just knew that they didn't have a record to confirm it. So the moral of the story is we have a lot of old systems, and old systems are contaminating the environment. That's the way it goes. So these are your considerations. Age is the biggest risk factor for failure and malfunction. So if your system is over 40 years old, you should probably have somebody take a look at it. Most failure and malfunction occurs in the pipes and the leaching field after the septic tank. So having people that specialize in pumping or inspecting just the tank, we're missing the point. Soil accounts for 70 to 80% of the organic and pathogenic removal from the sewage. So we need good, unsaturated soil. The building code for wastewater treatment has a prescribed amount of soil that volume of wastewater would need to percolate through in order to achieve the percentage reduction of pathogens and organic loading before it's discharged into the environment. So if you put a big sand filter on top of bald rock, you're going to end up having the water percolate down through, and you have to hope that you had enough sand there before it hits the rock, because once it hits the rock, it's in the water. So you have to be very cautious with where you build, and that's why we have lateral separation distances between the final receiving body and where the water would enter the environment. Septic tank solids accumulation must be measured regularly and pumped when they reach 1/3 of the working capacity of the tank. So it's a measurement. There's a device called a sludge judge. It's a clear pipe with 12-inch graduations. You push it down through, you pull a cord, it takes a stratified core sample, a plug of sewage out, and you can very quickly measure whether or not it's at 33% of the total tank volume. Those things cost $70 on Amazon. Your first pump out in some cases might be 3 or 4 times that amount. So it's worthwhile investing into maybe the time it takes to measure. So with all of this said, septic tanks must be made accessible. Does anybody know where their septic tank is? Does anybody not know where their septic tank is? Does anybody have a septic tank under a deck, under a 3 Seasons sunroom, underneath stamped concrete, underneath pavement? You are not alone, because there is a lot of infrastructure buried on properties that has been made inaccessible due to other construction. So you do need to do measurement, inspection, and maintenance on septic tanks. The only way we can do that is if you get into them. So I'm going to touch on quickly here municipal reinspection programs. There's basically been 3 types of programs. FOCA did a great job working with researcher to come up with what are the best practices from the municipalities that have done this type of work. I'm not really going to speak to what their results were, other than there were some similar sort of findings to what we found in the WSP and the ESSE data, that they didn't really require pump outs, but there are a lot of very old systems that were undersized and they hadn't been looked at very often. But what we've seen so far is municipal inspection programs. The first type that a lot of municipalities look at is one where the municipal staff assess the risk. Where is the risk? Which sites are we going to inspect? Which ones are going to be under inspection criteria? Then the municipal staff set the criteria for the inspections and the reporting. So they decide what they're going to look at. The reason this is important is if you don't look very hard, you don't find very much. So we have a lot of really well-promoted municipal reinspection programs that didn't look for shit and didn't find it either. They promoted it as an educational opportunity to hand a pamphlet out and basically look to see that there's no major overt malfunctions. But did we really hit the point? No, like, what is the point? Like, what are we trying to do? Particularly in Georgian Bay and cottage country, where we're trying to actually protect the water. Some of the programs have gone well. Others have produced data that would be, I would say, dubious at best in terms of the information provided for environmental protection. And in these same programs, the municipal staff complete the inspections and the reports. In a lot of cases, it's a student that does the inspection and produces the reports. There have been some blended programs, but that has been the majority that were discretionary to date. The second type, where the municipal staff assess the risk again, who's going to get inspected and why. They set the criteria for the inspections and the reporting, and then they put it out to tender, and they look for another entity or another third party to come in and do the inspection. They conduct the inspections as per the criteria, and then they will produce the reports for the owner and the municipality. The WSP data set would be an example of this type of program, and they have gone reasonably well. The challenge is, again, in what are we doing with the data? It's very difficult to extract the data out of these programs, so how do we use it? And then the third type of program is where universal risk is assessed. So all properties in a municipality are going to get inspected. The frequency of those inspections would be based on the risk. So the ones that have a high risk of environmental contamination to water resources may be inspected more frequently, and other properties that have less of a risk would be inspected less frequency, but they all get inspected. The staff set the criteria for the inspections and the reporting, and then various third-party contractors conduct the inspections, and they report to the owner, and then the owner has the responsibility to report to the municipality. We're seeing this up in the Saugeen Shores area, where they're having inspections done in order to report back to the municipality. That provides an opportunity for the owner to get multiple different service providers available to them, including the local haulers, maybe a design engineer, maybe a designer, maybe an installer. But it provides them some options. I like to say that's my favorite version of this, because it's more sustainable in that community, that it'll happen each time the frequency is set. The challenge with the bigger programs that are run by the municipality or by the engineering firms that are hired by the municipality, they might do it at year 1, but they'd be intended to do it at year 5 and year 10 and year 15, and they weren't really cost structured to be repeated. So there's some challenges. What are we actually trying to accomplish with these inspections, these re-inspection programs? Are we trying to make sure everybody gets a pamphlet? Or are we trying to make sure that we protect the water quality? So we have to find on that continuum what we want to do and why. Who's responsible for remedy of non-compliance? If you get there and the system's failed, who's going to be responsible for making sure it gets corrected? Can you get a second opinion on an assessment that says the system needs to be replaced? By a show of hands, does anybody know that there's $75,000 septic systems being installed in Ontario right now on private residential homes? $75,000. It's pretty normal in certain parts of the province. If you have a replacement septic system, you almost have to pay twice to get rid of the old stuff and to bring in the new stuff. It's very expensive. So if somebody's going to tell you you have to incur that expense, how do you get to determine how to do that? And what's the time frame to do that? So what are the primary objectives as I see them? It should be environmental public health protection of the water. If we take that as our baseline of why we're doing inspections, we should be able to guide inspection criteria that meet that outcome. So comprehensive inspections, whoever does it, we have to have a set criteria. This is how inspections need to be done. This is the bare minimum that needs to be inspected, and then we can compare the data across different municipalities. So what are the reasonable timeframes for completing inspection programs? It's been developing for 50 years, so I think we could probably take 4 or 5 to determine how to do it right. I know that we're in sort of an emergency and a crisis when it comes to, these systems are getting older by the year, and it's not a proportional increase in risk based on age. If they're 50 years old, they're probably contaminating the water. Access into septic tanks and camera inspections are vital. We need to know what's going on in the leaching field, not just say that the septic tank was pumped out and it looked okay. And third-party cost and liability agreement with the owner, whether this is the hauler or an engineering firm or just an inspector. It is a more reasonable way to spread the risks. The municipality can ask for a more comprehensive set of criteria without the municipality being fearful that they won't be able to do that type of inspection. So they can set the risk and then ask for the inspection to be done, as opposed to setting the risk and then trying to accomplish the inspection that achieves that outcome. So considerations for people that own septic systems in cottage country. Some simple actionable ideas for you to consider. Getting into septic tanks. You only want to do this once. The next time you dig up your septic tank, please let it be the last time. You don't need a shovel to do this any longer. We have the technology. And these guys are both strong, and I'm going to tear up a bit. They both quit on me because this is too hard of work to do every day. Getting into septic tanks is a challenge when people put all kinds of... The reason I put this one up here, this is the most ridiculous thing. So, do you see the cinder blocks? They weren't to raise the lid so we could get access. This system had failed, and the water was coming out the lids, so they put the cinder blocks on the lids to hold the lids down and hope that it would force the water into the right spot, when we could just do this. So if you have a standard septic tank and has 2 lids and it's 3 feet below grade, it'd be about $900, materials and labor, to put these types of lids on to bring it permanent access to grade and sealed. And your local contractor or local building concrete manufacturer will have these lids available for you. So next time you dig it up, consider just dropping these in behind the pile of dirt that's beside you and then find a way to move that excess soil. This is what it would end up looking like in most cases. You can access it year-round. Anybody here have grandchildren? Anybody know them to flush things down the toilet? G.I. Joe man on a rescue mission to Mars gets flushed and gets caught like this on the inlet side of the septic tank. You really want to deal with that at the tank. You want to open the tank, pull them out, throw them out, but pull them out, and put the lid back on. You don't want to deal with that from inside the home. So these are great, and it's very practical. But if you're going to do this and you're going to provide access into a septic tank on your property, you must also do this. It's a safety screen, so don't provide access unless there is a redundant safety mechanism that prevents anyone from ever falling in that tank. Your actual personal safety is far more important to me. So if you're going to put access risers on, you must have safety screens. They have these manufactured specifically for this purpose, so if you think a weekend project is to make your own access risers, think again, please. I'll even volunteer to come help you put these on, but don't make your own, because the problem with making your own is you end up with the same as the municipal systems. You end up with infiltration. If it's not air and water tight, and when it rains or the snow melts, the water will leak through your homemade risers and into the septic tank and overload the soil with surface water or rainwater that it can't handle. So measurement of solids accumulation every 24 to 36 months, that's the sludge judge, that's all it is. It takes 5 minutes once the lids are open, and you know whether or not you need to have a pump out, or you can put the lids back on and forget about it for another year. The rule I would use is measure twice, pump once. In a lot of cases, you're probably going to measure 3 or 4 times before you have to pump. Pump outs are going to become increasingly expensive in the province of Ontario because the availability of places to take that septage is going down at the same time as everybody's saying pump your tank out. So measure please. Systems since 2006 have required a screen or an effluent filter as it's described, but it's just a physical screen that goes vertically into the discharge pipe from the septic tank to the leaching field. Its intent is to hold on to any suspended material that would flow through that tank during peak usage, like you've done 3 loads of laundry and people are taking showers, or you're just flushing the toilet all the time because Bud Light goes through you like that. Either way, you could end up with an effluent filter that will plug after about 12 months. So you need to access this to clean it off at least every year. If this screen that I have on here plugs, the water will either come out the top of the tank or worse, it'll come up in the house. So if you have an effluent filter, which I suggest to you consider, it means you need to have access to that tank on an annual basis. You have pump chambers because if we don't have soil, we can rarely get gravity flow. So anybody here have a pump chamber on their septic system? It is one of the biggest vulnerabilities in the building code and wastewater. The pump chamber does not have a setback distance requirement to the water. And until last year, it didn't require an alarm, which is ridiculous. That's my example of how the building code kind of sucks, and we got to improve it. The fact that you could put a floating pump chamber in your boathouse and then pump up to the septic tank that has to be 15 meters away. So you're pumping raw sewage that's in the water up to a tank that can't be close to the water because of the contents. It's ridiculous. So if you do have a pump chamber, make sure you look at it every single year to test to see the alarm works. If that high-level alarm goes off on your pump chamber, it means the pump or the float that initiates the pump are not working, and that sewage, that raw sewage will end up in the environment untreated. And it's quite often in closer proximity to the water table that we're trying to protect. You also want to look in your tanks to see if there's corrosion. As I described earlier, that's a cast iron discharge inlet baffle, but you can see the rock, the rock here. So over time, that will just slowly disintegrate. And eventually you'll end up with a potential safety risk there too, because it'll be the top of the tank that will collapse. But it also has the potential to have water leak out around the pipes. So we have untreated septage or sewage leaking into the environment. The example that I would give you here about yellow and brown, flush it down. If your septic system is so vulnerable that you can't flush the toilet, which is the primary function of the infrastructure you have installed, is to receive that waste, I think you need to start budgeting for some upgrades. The other challenge that we have with low flush toilets and toilet paper is that if you have multiple people use a toilet before anybody flushes it, you run the risk of plugging the line between the house and the tank. So I got in trouble last time I said this. Please just flush the toilet. It seems like an absurd thing to have to tell people, but I know the yellow let it mellow thing, just flush the toilet, please. Because the risk of having a stained toilet is that you put bleach into it to clean the stain off, and the impact of those chemicals on the septic tank later is horrible. So you have permission to flush the toilet now. This is the big one. This will help with all the nutrients. This will help with your system. The system likes to digest food that's already been partially digested by you. But it doesn't have teeth, so it doesn't want the actual food. Fat, oils, and greases, through cooking, and bacon and eggs, or whatever it is that you cook, need to be wiped off and put into solid waste, because your septic system can't handle that stuff in very high amounts. It is the single biggest contributor to sludge accumulation in your septic tank is food particulates that end up in the tank, or that are just washed off in the dishwashing process. So sort, scrape, wipe it off, rinse, clean, sanitize. So I'm telling you how to live your life, I apologize, but. So we have a big opportunity. We can inspect these systems properly. We can inspect for the things that could be broken, not just the things that aren't broken. We can make a plan for what we're going to do in the future around this infrastructure, and then we're going to be protecting the water.